Hi everyone, and welcome back to Retro Legends. It was 1994 when Sony forever changed the history of video games. The PlayStation arrived in stores as a promise of the future, a powerhouse of innovation and technology. Its three-dimensional graphics, CD-quality music, cinematic cutscenes, everything screamed next generation. And in fact, it truly was. But where there is light, there is also shadow. Behind immortal icons like Final Fantasy VII, Metal Gear Solid, and Crash Bandicoot, there was an undergrowth of video game disasters that still make millions of players smile or cry today. For every masterpiece, there was a failed experiment, a project with no direction, a dream shipwrecked in the sea of 3D. Today, in this special episode of Retro Flops, I'll take you on a journey through the worst games ever released on the original PlayStation. Titles born in chaos, destroyed by haste, or simply terrible from the very start. Get ready, because we're about to discover the other side of the Sony legend. Don't forget to leave a like, subscribe to the channel, and hit the bell for more journeys into the world of retro gaming. Let's get started. When the PlayStation debuted in 1994, the world of video games was experiencing one of the most radical transformations in its history. For over a decade, video games had been two-dimensional, hand-drawn sprites, pixels crafted like digital miniatures, fluid movements achieved with fixed-frame animations. But suddenly, everything changed. 3D became the new frontier. The promise of real, freely explorable three-dimensional worlds captivated the entire industry. The only problem was, no one really knew how to create them. Many studios came from Super Nintendo or Mega Drive experiences, where the work was totally different. Artists drew sprites, programmers managed two-dimensional planes, and game physics boiled down to a few lines of code. With the PlayStation, all of that was no longer enough. Now you had to model polygons, calculate perspectives, manage depth of field, animate three-dimensional skeletons, and above all, invent a completely new visual language. There were no design rules for 3D yet. There were no game engines like Unreal or Unity. Every software house had to create its own engine from scratch. The development libraries provided by Sony were basic, often incomplete, and the debugging tools rudimentary. In practice, anyone who decided to make a 3D game in the 90s was working on the edge of the unknown. The first three-dimensional titles on PlayStation are living proof of this. Camera management was often disastrous because no one had yet found a universal way to make them work well. Some games adopted fixed cameras, like in the first Resident Evil, to avoid perspective errors. Others, like Tomb Raider, experimented with dynamic cameras that often ended up getting stuck in walls or pointing in the wrong direction. Controls were also a minefield. Many developers, still accustomed to 2D logic, designed rigid and unintuitive commands. The result was characters that moved like robots, responded with delay, or got stuck in the scenery. Just one poorly calibrated jump was enough to send the protagonist falling off the map. Another huge problem was collision management. In 2D, it was enough to define a few boxes to check if two sprites touched. In 3D, the math was infinitely more complex. Objects got stuck, enemies fell through the floor, bullets hit invisible targets. It was a technical chaos, but also fertile ground for innovation. Many titles considered terrible today were, in reality, pioneering experiments. Jumping Flash, for example, with its first-person perspective and incredibly high jumps, showed a completely new approach to platforming. Or Battle Arena Toshinden, which, despite being clunky, laid the groundwork for the future explosion of 3D fighting games. There was also a hardware issue. The PlayStation was a powerful machine for its time, but with severe limitations. It didn't have a dedicated depth calculation chip, and this created the famous texture warping, that distortion effect that made moving surfaces shimmer. Developers had to invent tricks and optimizations to mask it, often with questionable results. In short, The early years of the PlayStation were an obstacle course between ambition and inexperience. Each team tried to understand how the new language of 3D worked, and they did it on the fly, making mistakes, correcting them, starting over. For this reason, many games now considered flops are actually historical testimonies of an era of pure exploration, when every project was a leap into the unknown, and every failure taught something. During that period, the PlayStation was truly a laboratory of ideas, a crossroads of innovations, dreams, and technical mishaps that would shape the future of game design. But for many inexperienced developers, it was also a trap. A machine that rewarded genius, but mercilessly punished those who weren't ready to tame it. If there's one game that perfectly encapsulates everything that could go wrong in the transition from 2D to 3D, that game is undoubtedly Bubsy 3D. Released in 1996 and developed by the American studio Accolade, the title emerged during a period when the world of platformers was undergoing a revolution. Super Mario 64 had just arrived on the Nintendo 64, completely redefining the concepts of movement, freedom, and spatial perception. Everyone wanted their own 3D Mario. Accolade didn't want to be left behind. They already had a mascot, Bubsy, the anthropomorphic cat protagonist of some mediocre but commercially decent platformers on Mega Drive and SNES, and decided to launch him into the third dimension. The intention was clear: to transform him into PlayStation's new symbol, the American answer to the myth of Mario. The problem? No one on the team truly knew how to make a 3D game. The development group, Eidetic, a small internal studio at Accolade, had no experience with polygonal graphics, nor access to advanced development tools. They worked with incomplete debug kits and a rudimentary understanding of 3D geometry. Despite this, they decided to build the graphics engine from scratch, an undertaking that even large companies like Capcom or Konami struggled with. The technical result was surreal. Bubsy 3D featured environments completely devoid of textures, with monochromatic pastel surfaces that gave the game world an abstract, almost psychedelic look. Objects seemed to float in a void, and the level of detail was so sparse that it was difficult to distinguish platforms, enemies, or backgrounds. It was like moving inside a cubist painting, but without any artistic coherence, not by stylistic choice, but due to technical limitations and inexperience. The real nightmare, however, was the controls. Bubsy 3D adopted a tank movement system similar to that of the early Resident Evil games. The character didn't move in the direction of the D-pad, but rotated on their own axis before moving forward. A disaster for a platformer, where timing and jump precision are everything. Every jump became an act of faith, complicated by a totally uncontrollable camera, which changed angles on its own and often positioned itself behind walls or in absurd locations. The player never knew where they were about to land. As if that wasn't enough, the soundtrack amplified the psychologically disturbing experience. A dissonant loop of random notes, devoid of melody and rhythm, repeating endlessly. Every element seemed designed to test the player's patience. Yet behind this failure, there was a sincere intention. The developers wanted to experiment. In a subsequent interview, some members of Eidetic recounted that the game was meant to show the potential of 3D on the PlayStation, but that time was their worst enemy. They had less than a year of development and no example to follow. Super Mario 64 was released just a few weeks earlier, by which time Bubsy 3D was almost complete. They had no way to learn from that masterpiece. The result was merciless. Critics savaged it without mercy. Specialized magazines described it as visually confused, technically backward, and impossible to play. Electronic Gaming Monthly called it a failed experiment that felt more like a prototype than a complete game. And the public was no more lenient. Sales were disastrous, and Bubsy became synonymous with a failed mascot. But the story of Bubsy 3D doesn't end in disaster. It's also a story of redemption. Eidetic, humbled by the experience, learned from their mistakes. Working for Sony, they began to better study the console's potential and focus on a completely different genre, stealth action. In 1999, they released Siphon Filter, a technically solid title with innovative controls and mature gameplay, which achieved enormous success and gave rise to a long-running saga. In other words, without the failure of Bubsy 3D, there would have been no Siphon Filter. That disaster taught the team what not to do, how not to manage the camera, how not to build a graphics engine, how not to balance a 3D experience. It's proof that even the worst flops can become fundamental design lessons. Today, Bubsy 3D is remembered as a kind of toxic relic, a naive experiment, yet fascinating in its clumsiness. An involuntary monument to an era when 3D was still a wild frontier, where every step forward was preceded by a long series of falls. The 1996 film The Crow, City of Angels was already a controversial sequel to the cult classic starring Brandon Lee, but the video game based on it managed, incredibly, to be even worse. Published by Acclaim in 1997 on PlayStation and Saturn, the title was a 3D beat-em-up that tried to recreate the gothic and decadent atmosphere of the film, but it ended up becoming one of the worst games of its time. At first glance, The Crow, City of Angels promised a dark and cinematic experience. The protagonist, Ash, had to avenge his death fighting through foggy alleys and cemeteries. However, it only took a few minutes of gameplay to realize the disaster. The characters looked like they were modeled in clay, with clumsy movements and broken animations. Collisions were so imprecise that you often hit nothing, while the camera rotated confusingly, making it impossible to orient yourself. The controls responded with a noticeable delay, making every fight a continuous frustration. Behind these problems was a very specific cause. Acclaim imposed very strict deadlines on the development team to release the game concurrently with the film's distribution. The project was therefore completed in just a few months, with no time for testing or refinement. The result was a technically unstable and artistically flat title, unable to capture the dark poetry of the original film. The reviews of the time were merciless. Magazines like GamePro and Electronic Gaming Monthly called it a punishment for fans of the film and an experience to be forgotten. Over time, The Crow, City of Angels has become an emblematic example of how film licenses, if exploited hastily and carelessly, can turn from a golden opportunity into a foretold disaster. In the 90s, Mortal Kombat was much more than just a video game. It was a cultural phenomenon. Arcades, consoles, movies, merchandise. The brand created by Ed Boon and John Tobias was everywhere. But as often happens with huge successes, there came the urge to expand too much, too quickly. Among the various experiments, one of the most disastrous was Mortal Kombat: Special Forces, released in 2000 on PlayStation. It was supposed to be a spectacular spin-off, a 3D action game focused on Jax Briggs, the soldier with cybernetic arms, on a military mission against the Black Dragon, the same criminal organization as Kano. The idea was for a more mature game, full of infiltrations, shootouts, and hand-to-hand combat. But things went terribly wrong. During development, Ed Boon left the project, disappointed by the direction it was taking and by the internal relationships at Midway, which were already strained. A few months later, John Tobias also left the company, leaving the team without creative leadership. The result was a title completed in a rush, practically without any supervision. The final game was a technical and artistic disaster, empty and monotonous levels, graphics outdated even by 1996 standards, bugs everywhere, and a camera so unstable that even moving around was frustrating. The combat, which should have been the heart of the gameplay, was slow, imprecise, and completely lacked impact. Even the narrative side was full of holes. The cutscenes seemed improvised, with flat voice acting and embarrassing performances, while the story tried to be serious but ended up feeling like a parody. The failure of Special Forces marked one of the darkest moments for the saga. After the already disappointing Mortal Kombat, Mythologies, Sub-Zero, this second spin-off completely destroyed the fans' trust. Even Midway, years later, admitted that the game was a stain on the franchise's history, and in many interviews, Ed Boon has called it one of the lowest points of his career. Only with Mortal Kombat, Deadly Alliance in 2002 did the series manage to recover, reinventing itself and returning to success. But Special Forces still stands today as a textbook example of how even a legendary brand can fall into the abyss when time, vision, and passion are missing. At the end of the 1990s, Joe Dante's 1998 film Small Soldiers promised to win over both kids and adults with its blend of satire, action, and living toys. DreamWorks saw the perfect opportunity to launch an official video game to accompany the film's release, and so Small Soldiers, the game was born, developed by DreamWorks Interactive for PlayStation and PC. The idea was simple but intriguing. A fast-paced action game where the player controlled Archer, leader of the Gorgonites, against the ruthless Commando elite in environments inspired by scenes from the movie. It was supposed to be a light, ironic, and action-packed title, but reality turned out to be very different. The final result was one of the most frustrating experiences in the entire PlayStation library. The aiming system was so imprecise that even hitting stationary enemies was difficult. The camera moved erratically, and collisions didn't work properly. The levels were repetitive and poorly designed, often filled with useless objects or empty areas. The graphics, while colorful and consistent with the film's tone, already looked outdated and bare in 1998, especially when compared to contemporary titles like Medal of Honor or Tomb Raider 3. Behind this technical disaster was a chaotic development process. DreamWorks Interactive was working under enormous pressure. The game absolutely had to be released at the same time as the film, and the developers were constantly receiving changes to the script and character rights, often just weeks before launch. Some 3D models were redone multiple times, while entire sections of gameplay were cut or simplified to meet deadlines. The result was a rushed and incoherent title, lacking polish and identity. What could have been a fun, cartoon-style third-person shooter turned into a frustrating experience, hampered by poorly balanced gameplay and mediocre technical execution. Reviews at the time were merciless. Magazines like GamePro and official PlayStation Magazine highlighted the poor controls and lack of variety, while many players called the game a playable advertisement. Once again, marketing triumphed over design, and a potential little gem was crushed under the weight of Hollywood deadlines. Today, Small Soldiers remains a prime example of how, in the 1990s, the rush to release games alongside movies often meant sacrificing quality on the altar of promotion, turning a promising idea into a missed opportunity. In the mid-90s, the video game industry was obsessed with the concept of cinematic experience. After the success of titles like Resident Evil and Tomb Raider, many studios tried to blend 3D graphics, motion capture, and mature storylines to give the audience the feeling of living an interactive movie. Perfect Weapon, published by ASC Games in 1996, was supposed to be one of these ambitious projects. On paper, it promised a grand, realistic action-adventure, with a martial arts expert protagonist thrown into hostile alien worlds. In practice, it turned out to be one of the most frustrating and technically disastrous titles ever to appear on PlayStation. The game presented itself as a mix of exploration and hand-to-hand combat, but from the very first minutes, it showed all its limitations. The motion capture animations, which were supposed to provide realism and fluidity, appeared stiff and uncoordinated. Every punch, kick, or dodge was excruciatingly slow, making it feel like moving a puppet under sedatives. The fixed camera, a trick borrowed from survival horror games, only made things worse here. Battles often took place off-screen, making it impossible to tell where enemies were. But the most incredible flaw was the protagonist's movement. Every step was an agony. Commands responded with delay, and it took whole seconds to turn the character around. Moving from one point on the map to another became a test of patience rather than skill. Even the jumps, rare but necessary, were a nightmare of precision, with imprecise collisions and unforgiving animation timings. The paradox is that Perfect Weapon had ambitious ideas. The team wanted to create a mature game, with a serious narrative and settings inspired by 1980s American science fiction. There were full-motion video cutscenes and professional voice acting, at least in intention, but the final result was an incoherent mess. The video sequences were poorly edited, the story confusing, and the artistic direction alternated interesting environments with completely empty ones. The specialized press of the time showed no mercy. Magazines like GameFan and Next Generation called it a clumsy attempt to imitate Tomb Raider without understanding why it worked, while GamePro labeled it as torture for anyone with an ounce of patience. Over time, Perfect Weapon has become a small cult classic, but for all the wrong reasons. It is remembered as a symbol of the premature ambitions of the 32-bit era, when developers sought cinematic realism, but technology, and often design, were not yet ready. A project born with great promises ended up being one of the most cumbersome, frustrating, and unintentionally comical games of the first PlayStation. By the late 90s, 3D platformers were the go-to genre on PlayStation. Titles like Crash Bandicoot and Spyro the Dragon had shown that, with the right amount of control and design, even the leap into 3D could work. Following that success, in 1998, the software house Traveller's Tales, the same one that would later create the LEGO games, and the publisher Psygnosis, launched Rascal, a light-hearted, colorful platformer with a protagonist equipped with a bubble gun and the ability to travel through time. On paper, it seemed perfect for conquering the younger audience. The problem? The camera. Controlled entirely by artificial intelligence and not by the player, it was literally untamable. Instead of following the character smoothly, it moved unpredictably, rotating at the worst moments, or placing itself behind walls, columns, and enemies. The result, jumping from one platform to another, became a lottery. It often happened that you fell into the void without even understanding where the floor was. In combat, then, the framing suddenly changed, making it impossible to hit enemies or even just understand where they were. Yet, Rascal was not an improvised project. The initial idea was ambitious, a 3D adventure with varied worlds, a time travel story, and an interactive cartoon tone. The team had even involved artists and designers from the Disney world, with the aim of giving the game a recognizable and brilliant visual style. The result, at least aesthetically, worked. The levels were lively, full of colors and details, with settings ranging from the Renaissance to futuristic scenarios. But behind the facade lay chaos. The level design was confusing and disorienting, full of paths that intertwined illogically, doors that opened only under certain conditions, and enemies placed frustratingly. The time travel story, potentially interesting, was told in a fragmented and unclear way, with short and often disconnected cutscenes. Even the soundtrack, though pleasant, ended up repeating obsessively, amplifying the sense of frustration. The most ironic point is that Rascal's camera has become almost legendary in video game history, but for the wrong reasons. Many reviewers at the time called it the game's true boss, an invisible but unbeatable enemy. Magazines like Official PlayStation Magazine and GameSpot demolished the title, pointing out how a simple mechanic, camera control, was enough to completely ruin a project full of potential. Over time, Rascal has been re-evaluated by some as a fascinating failure, a game that wanted to dare, but fell victim to technical limitations and overly premature design choices. A perfect example of how, in the years of transition to 3D, even good ideas could founder in the chaos of change. At the end of the 1990s, every major mistake in the world of video games was also an experiment. The flops of that generation, no matter how disastrous or ridiculous they seemed, played a crucial role. They taught the industry what not to do. Every failed title left a clear lesson behind. Games like Rascal or Perfect Weapon showed just how important it was to give players full control of the camera and to build a smooth movement system. Others, like The Crow, City of Angels, or Small Soldiers, proved that forcing a movie license and rushing a release just to coincide with a film was a surefire recipe for disaster. But from these mistakes, the foundations of the medium's maturity were born. Developers realized that it wasn't enough to impress with shiny polygons or digitized characters. What was needed was a coherent, responsive, and engaging experience. After the failures of the first 3D experiments, software houses learned to design smarter cameras, more precise controls, and game worlds that didn't just exist, but actually worked. Without Bubsy 3D, we probably wouldn't have had Siphon Filter or Ape Escape, which took those same difficulties and turned them into innovation. And without the risk and failure of titles like Mortal Kombat, Special Forces, Midway wouldn't have had the push to completely reinvent the franchise, eventually bringing it back to life with the 2011 reboot. These disasters weren't just simple slip-ups, they were imperfect but necessary experiments. The first PlayStation, with its vast and uneven catalog, became a true laboratory of evolution. Every success was born on a pile of previous mistakes. Every great idea was, at its core, a response to a failure. And maybe that's exactly why we remember even the worst games of that era so fondly. Because behind every bug, every crazy camera, or shaky animation, there was the will to push further, to see just how far video games could go. Without those failed experiments, today we wouldn't have believable open worlds, spectacular cutscenes, or refined gameplay. In a way, the worst PlayStation games didn't ruin video game history. They built it. And with this, our journey into the past comes to an end. How many of these curiosities did you already know? Let us know in the comments. Don't forget to leave a like and subscribe to the channel and activate the notification bell for more journeys into the world of retro gaming. Thanks for watching Retro Legends, and we'll see you in the next video. Stay retro, stay legends.